The sun was beginning to set behind the hills when the group of friends arrived at Marcos's uncle's house, an old recluse who lived alone in a decaying house on the outskirts of town. They had been called to help clean up the place, as Marcos's uncle had recently passed away, leaving behind a pile of things nobody knew what to do with. The house was in complete disarray, covered in a layer of dust, with the scent of aged wood in the air. However, something that afternoon felt off, something they couldn't quite put their finger on, but it was there, lingering in every dark corner of the house. Marcos, along with his three friends, Lucas, Beatrice, and Anna, walked slowly down the hallways, rifling through drawers and boxes. The plan was simple: grab anything of value and leave the rest behind. They had already passed through the living room and kitchen, where the old furniture was covered in mold-stained sheets. But it was in the attic, a stuffy room with stagnant air, that the discovery happened. It was Lucas who first noticed something out of place. He was perched on an old chair, pulling boxes from above. On one of the far shelves, something caught his eye, a dark wooden box with mysterious carvings, but no visible markings. The lid was slightly askew, as if it had been tampered with recently. Despite the layer of dust, the smell, a mix of aged wood and something else, something almost metallic, enveloped Lucas as he approached. "What's this?" Beatrice asked, stepping cautiously closer, her eyes fixed on the box. Marcos, curious, looked at the box and immediately felt an odd sensation. It was as if something inside it was calling to him. Without hesitation, he opened the lid. What he found inside wasn't what he expected. A board game, much older than anything he'd ever seen. The pieces were made of a dark, almost black material, and the board seemed hand-painted, with intricate designs that resembled arcane symbols. In the center of the board was a strange figure, a human-like shape with empty eyes, from which emanated a feeling of something distant and threatening. "This doesn't seem safe, Marcos," Anna said, her face filled with suspicion as she stared at the board. But Marcos, who had always been the bravest of the group, smiled confidently. "Oh, what's the harm? Let's just take a look. Who knows what else we might find here?" And that's how the group, driven by curiosity and the desire to explore the unknown, decided to test the game. Unknowingly, they had just unleashed something they would never be able to control. The group gathered around the table in the attic, the dim light from the hanging lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The board was on an old table, covered in dust, but it seemed like nothing could interrupt the irresistible pull of the newly discovered game. The pieces, dark and unsettling, were perfectly aligned next to the board, as if waiting for the first move. "Let's see what happens," Marco said, a smile on his face. He seemed genuinely excited, as if he were about to embark on an adventure. Lucas, Beatrice, and Anna, more skeptical, exchanged nervous glances, but no one wanted to be the first to back down. The tension was in the air, but the desire to see what the game could do was stronger. Marcos picked up one of the pieces, a small figurine sculpted in a bizarre way, and placed it in the starting position. The soft sound of the piece sliding across the board echoed in the quiet room. They all watched, waiting for any reaction. Nothing happened immediately, but then a faint sound, almost imperceptible, emerged. It was like a distant whisper, a murmur that didn't seem to come from anywhere, but was everywhere at once. Everyone looked at each other, uneasy, unsure whether they were just imagining things or if the sound was real. "Hey, what's that?" Beatrice asked, her voice shaking as she looked around. Anna frowned, eyeing the board suspiciously. "I didn't hear anything. It's getting late. I think we should stop here." But Lucas, more impatient, didn't want to miss the chance to continue. Stop being dramatic. It was probably just the wind. Let's play one more round. He picked up another piece and made his move. As soon as the piece touched the board, the lamp above flickered quickly, then went out. The group fell silent. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The air, once stuffy, was now icy, as if a cold draft had swept through the space. Beatrice involuntarily shivered, the cold biting right through her bones. "What the hell is going on?" she said, her breath visibly fogging in the frozen air. Marcos looked at the others, trying to hide his growing discomfort. "Probably an electrical failure. Let's keep going." The game barely started, but when he looked back at the board, the pieces had moved. Not by much, but enough to make it impossible to ignore. One of the pieces was now near the edge of the board, as if it had moved on its own. The sound of wind, now stronger, seemed to whistle through the broken windows of the house. "Okay, this isn't right," Anna said, her voice trembling. "It's not just the wind. Something is happening." They all looked, and that's when one of them noticed something else. On the edge of the board, the intricate symbols began to glow faintly, as if some hidden energy was activating. The feeling was unmistakable. It was as if the game wasn't just an inanimate object, but something alive. "I'm out of here," Beatrice said, standing up abruptly. But before she could take a step, the environment around them shifted again. The house seemed to have grown darker, more oppressive. The sounds from outside the room had completely vanished, as if the house had fallen into complete silence, except for the sound of their hurried breaths. Marcos was in a state of denial. He didn't want to admit that something was happening, that the game was somehow altering the reality around him. "It's just a game, guys. Relax." But in the next moment, the lamp flickered again, and when it turned back on, the reflection in the window showed a shadow on the wall behind them. A figure, tall and indistinct, seemed to move slowly through the shadows of the room. Marcos stepped toward the window, trying to look outside, but as he did, he heard a whisper directly in his ear. Something incomprehensible, but it sent a deep chill down his spine. "I'm not liking this anymore," Anna said, her voice almost a whisper. The game, it seemed, was just getting started, and with each move, the world around them grew more distorted. The silence in the room was suffocating. The whisper of the shadowy figure that had passed behind them still echoed in their minds, making them feel watched, as if they were being observed by something that shouldn't be there. The cold air seemed to thicken, and the atmosphere, already heavy with palpable tension, now felt strangely oppressive, as if the very space itself had begun to crumble. Marcos, visibly uncomfortable, tried to keep his composure. "It's just our imagination," he said, trying to ignore the growing terror in his chest. "It's all just a coincidence. Let's keep going." But no one responded. Anna was frozen, staring at the board, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Marcos, did you see that? The shadow, that wasn't normal. It wasn't just an illusion." Beatrice had her back to the window, her eyes fixed on the game, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. "I saw it too. I saw the shadow in the window's reflection, but it couldn't have been real. It couldn't." Lucas seemed less affected, but even he couldn't deny what was happening. When he looked at the board, a feeling of panic gripped him. The pieces had moved again, but this time, there was no denying that something was happening. Each piece was now positioned in a way that seemed to reflect the emotional state of each player, a symbolic representation of their fears and insecurities. "Okay, that's enough," Beatrice said, already getting up from her chair. "This isn't a game anymore. It's getting dangerous." She took a step toward the door, but before she could reach the doorknob, a sound of something falling made everyone turn around. One of the old wooden chairs, which had been leaning against the wall, moved on its own, slowly scraping across the floor as if someone had sat in it. The creaking sound of what filled the room, intensifying the tension among the group. Marcos, still reluctant, glanced at the board. "Let's finish this already. One last move, and we'll get out of here." He picked up a piece and, with a trembling hand, moved it to the next spot. When the piece touched the board, the whole house shook slightly, and the sound of something breaking echoed down the halls. The light bulb flickered again, but this time, it didn't go out completely. It just stayed dim, almost as if it was trying to keep something hidden in the shadows. I don't understand," murmured Lucas. "Why is everything getting weird? How is this even possible?" At that moment, Beatrice, who had been trying to pull away from the game, looked at the window again. The reflection in the glass seemed distorted, but it wasn't just the lighting that was strange. There, inside the glass, a figure with empty eyes was watching her. She moved closer to the window, touching the glass with her hand, trying to push the image away. But as she did, the figure in the reflection also moved, mimicking her gestures, as if it was somewhere else, but at the same time, still there. Panic began to take over the group. "We need to stop this," Anna said, her voice faltering. She was already pulling away from the board, but the sound of her boots hitting the floor echoed strangely, as if the sound was being amplified. Marcos looked at the others, but there was no more confidence in his gaze. The game didn't feel like just a game anymore. Something was happening around them. With every move, reality was unraveling. Objects that had been in the room just moments ago began to disappear. The walls seemed to shift subtly, distorting and contorting, as if they were about to swallow everything around them. And then, in the moment Marcos raised his hand to make the next move, a shadow materialized in the corner of the room. A tall, indistinct shadow, almost human, but with blurred edges, as if it were transitioning between one plane and another. Beatrice screamed, "What is that? What's happening?" The game, as if it had taken on a life of its own, seemed to be responding to their desperate attempt to escape. The board, which had been still until then, began to glow faintly along the edges. But now, the light emanating from the board was like a portal, an opening to something they couldn't understand. The shadow in the corner slowly approached, and each step it took made the sound of their breathing grow louder, closer. "Okay, that's enough," Beatrice said, already getting up from her chair. "This isn't a game anymore. It's getting dangerous." She took a step toward the door, but before she could reach the doorknob, a sound of something falling made everyone turn around. One of the old wooden chairs, which had been leaning against the wall, moved on its own, slowly dragging across the floor, as if someone had sat in it. The creaking sound of what filled the room, increasing the tension among the group. Marcos, still reluctant, looked at the board. "Let's finish this quickly. One last move and we'll leave." He picked up a piece and, with a trembling hand, moved it to the next spot. When the piece touched the board, the whole house shook slightly, and the sound of something breaking echoed down the hallways. The light bulb flickered again, once more, but this time it didn't go out completely. It just stayed dim, almost as if it were trying to keep something hidden in the shadows. I don't get it," murmured Lucas. "Why is everything getting weird? How is this even possible?" At that moment, Beatrice, who had been trying to pull away from the game, looked at the window again. The reflection in the glass seemed distorted, but it wasn't just the lighting that was strange. There, inside the glass, a figure with empty eyes was watching her. She moved closer to the window, touching the glass with her hand, trying to push the image away. But as she did, the figure in the reflection also moved, mimicking her gestures, as if it were somewhere else, but at the same time, still there. Panic began to take over the group. "We need to stop this," Anna said, her voice faltering. She was already pulling away from the board, but the sound of her boots hitting the floor echoed strangely, as if the sound was being amplified. Marcos looked at the others, but there was no longer any confidence in his gaze. The game didn't feel like just a game anymore. Something was happening around them. With every move, reality was unraveling. Objects that had been in the room just moments ago began to disappear. The walls seemed to shift subtly, distorting and contorting, as if they were about to swallow everything around them. And then, in the moment Marcos raised his hand to make the next move, a shadow materialized in the corner of the room. A tall, indistinct shadow, almost human, but with blurred edges, as if it were transitioning between one plane and another. Beatrice screamed, "What is that? What's happening?" The game, as if it had taken on a life of its own, seemed to be responding to their desperate attempt to escape. The board, which had been still until then, began to glow faintly along the edges. But now, the light emanating from the board was like a portal, an opening to something they couldn't understand. The shadow in the corner slowly approached, and with every step it took, the sound of its breathing grew louder, closer. "I can't do this anymore," Anna said. Her eyes filled with tears, feeling that something was about to take over her mind. She tried to run to the door, but when she turned around, the door had disappeared. There was no door anymore. There was nothing but the growing darkness. The friends were trapped inside a game they didn't know how to control, with a reality that no longer belonged to them. And the worst part, they were playing with their own lives. Fear gripped the group like an electric current. The feeling that they were losing control over reality intensified, as if the rules of the game didn't just alter the environment but also their fate. They were stuck in a nightmare, and every move seemed to take them deeper into a distorted reality that they couldn't comprehend. Anna, her eyes fixed on the board, desperately tried to find a way to stop. She touched one of the pieces, but before she could move it, a wave of pain shot through her head, as if something were trying to invade her thoughts. She dropped the piece, shuddering, and looked around, feeling a growing pressure in her chest. This isn't normal. We can't stop playing. There's no choice anymore. Beatrice, now completely paralyzed by the sight of the shadow, couldn't look at the window anymore. Every time she turned, she saw the blurry silhouette, its black, empty eyes, and the sound it made as it moved, a whisper as if it were trying to say something but never emitting any sound. "I can't breathe anymore," Lucas murmured, his voice trembling. He tried to speak, but his words seemed suffocated, as if something was holding him, preventing him from expressing himself. "You see that too, right?" Marcos asked, more to himself than to the others. His breath was faster, and fear was now stamped on his face. He looked at the board, as if searching for an answer. The pieces were moving on their own, switching places erratically, as if an invisible hand was playing with them. The sound of the game now seemed to be echoing in their ears, muffled and distorted. It was no longer just a board game. It felt like an echo of something much larger, older, more sinister. The rules were changing with every move, as if the pieces were feeding off their emotions, their deepest fears. Marcos looked at the others, his words coming out with difficulty. It feels like we're playing with our own lives." And at that moment, the group understood the truth in a horrible way. The game wasn't just altering the environment around them. It was starting to alter the very essence of their existence. Every move, every piece moved, seemed to affect something deeper, as if they were changing the fundamental laws of their reality. Beatrice tried to pull away from the board, but as she stood up, she tripped and fell back into the chair, her hand accidentally touching the board. When this happened, a strange sense of disorientation overwhelmed her. She no longer knew where she was, as if the dimensions around her had warped in a way she couldn't understand. "Beatrice!" Anna screamed, trying to hold her friend, but Beatrice was no longer there. She looked at the chair where Beatrice had been sitting and, to her horror, saw that she was dissolving, as if reality itself was swallowing her. Beatrice's body wasn't physically disintegrating, but it was starting to disappear, as if it were a blurred image, distorting itself until it no longer existed. "No! Beatrice!" Lucas screamed, desperate, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the growing vacuum, a mounting pressure that made everything around them feel like it was closing in, compressing them into a smaller and smaller space. Anna stood up and ran to where Beatrice had vanished, but her feet began sinking into the floor as if the ground was becoming sticky, the objects around her distorting and fusing into one another. Reality was crumbling, and with it, the ability to distinguish between the real and the unreal was disappearing. Marcos was now at the center of the chaos. He felt an invisible force pulling him toward the board, as if it wanted to absorb his essence. He tried to fight it, but the sensation of being consumed by his own existence was stronger than his will to escape. He looked at the game once more, and the pieces began moving frantically, jumping out of place in a macabre dance. It was as if the game was playing them, not the other way around. With every move, something new and terrifying emerged. There was no more logical explanation. There was no reason anymore. They were just in a game of pure survival, where the pieces were their own lives and the board a prison of terror. "We have to finish this," Marco said, his voice filled with dread. He knew there was no way out, that the only way to try to regain control was to complete the game. But as he spoke, the words seemed to distort and get lost somewhere, as if they no longer held any value. The game was far from over, and whatever had been summoned with the first move seemed to be just beginning. The room was completely enveloped in a heavy silence, as if the entire world had stopped. Every breath seemed amplified, a sound echoing in their own ears, as the walls seemed to close in on them, suffocating them in a mental and physical prison. The lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced on the walls, distorting the shapes around them. Marcos was trembling, fear eating away at his insides. He no longer knew what was happening. What had once been an apparently innocent game had now turned into a battle for their sanity. Every move on the board seemed to resonate in their minds in unpredictable ways, distorting their perception of reality. Anna, her face pale and eyes wide, stared at the chair where Beatrice had been sitting, now completely empty. The emptiness was a cruel reminder that her friend had disappeared, consumed by the game. She looked around, trying to find some explanation, something that might give them a chance to escape, but all she saw was a growing desolation. "This can't be happening," she whispered, almost to herself. Beatrice can't have vanished like that." Lucas, visibly calmer than the others, but with a vacant look in his eyes, pulled away from the board, as if fearing that any movement on his part could cause another distortion in reality. "It's no use anymore," he said, his voice muffled, as though he were speaking from a distant place. "It doesn't matter what we do. The game has already got us, and it's too late." Marcos looked at the board, where the pieces moved frantically, nonstop, as if controlled by an invisible force, an entity that fed on fear and anguish. He felt a growing pressure in his mind, as if he was being forced to play, as if the game was no longer a choice, but a necessity. Something inside him knew that if they stopped, the consequences would be even more terrible. But he didn't know what would happen if they continued. Without warning, Beatrice's voice sounded, weak and distorted, as if it were coming from within the board itself. "Marcos, Lucas, Anna." Beatrice's voice was filled with pain, a deep despair that seemed to emanate from a place very far away, yet at the same time, very close. "Listen to me, the game, it's taking you all." The voice disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a chilling echo that dragged itself through the room. Lucas stepped toward the board, but his hand trembled uncontrollably. He hesitated, looking at the pieces, as if each one was a reflection of his own distorted soul. I don't want to play anymore," Lucas said, his voice barely audible. "But what happens if we don't play? What happens to us?" Anna, with tears in her eyes, looked at Marcos, searching for some answer, but there was nothing left to say. Whatever was happening was beyond comprehension. Reality was disintegrating slowly, and every move seemed to consume a part of their humanity. Suddenly, one of the pieces on the board lifted by itself, floating a few inches above the surface, as if it were being levitated by an invisible force. It slowly spun in the air before falling back down, making a metallic sound that echoed through the room. And it was at that exact moment that the lights went out completely. The darkness was impenetrable. Nothing could be seen. Nothing could be heard. Only the sound of their hurried breaths, now gasping, as if they were being forced to breathe through a tight lid. Then, as if a curtain had been lifted, a faint light illuminated the room. It wasn't an ordinary light. It emanated from the center of the board, which now shone with a supernatural intensity. But the glow didn't come from the surface of the board. It rose from within, as if something was about to materialize there, something that shouldn't exist. Marcos took a step forward, but something stopped him. He could no longer move his feet, as if the floor had become an extension of the board, and he was being pulled into it. "This isn't just a game," murmured Marcos, his words breaking under the growing pressure. "The game is becoming our reality. Every move is our last chance." He looked at the board, and something that should never have been said crossed his mind, something he didn't know if he could say out loud. The game had a purpose, a much darker purpose than they could ever imagine. And now, the only thing left to do was to keep playing, or pay the price for trying to escape. The room was tense, as if the very atmosphere was on the brink of shattering. The flickering lights, the muffled sound of heavy breathing, and the feeling that something was watching them created an unbearable pressure. Every movement felt like it carried a mortal weight. The board was illuminated by a cold, pulsating light, a glow emanating from the center of the pieces, as if something was forming there, something that wasn't human, not even something they could understand. Marcos, still paralyzed by fear, stared fixedly at the board, feeling the eyes of the invisible entity upon him. He knew that something was about to happen. It was no longer a question of if something would happen. It was a matter of when, and the game was just beginning to reveal its true face. "Marcos, are you seeing this?" Lucas's voice was trembling, but filled with an eerie curiosity. He stepped closer to the board, his fingers almost touching the pieces, as if something was drawing him in. The light, it's not normal. Something's inside the game, something different. Anna, who had been silent until then, her hands covering her face as if trying to block the reality around her, finally looked at the board. Her hands began to shake violently, and the sense that everything they were experiencing now was an illusion began to invade her mind. This isn't a game." Her voice sounded like a whisper, but her words were clear, as if the truth was finally revealing itself in a cruel way. We're inside it." The glow of the board started to intensify, and suddenly, the pieces jumped up, floating above the board, as if controlled by an unseen force. They began to cluster together, moving on their own, and then, as though completing a ritual, they started to form a shape in the center of the room. The air grew thicker, and the weight on each of their chests increased, as if something beyond human comprehension was watching them. A dark shadow began to emerge from the center of the board, an indistinct being whose form constantly shifted. Sometimes, it looked human. Other times, it seemed like a blend of everything fear had ever conjured. And then, when it finally took shape, it became clear what it was: an entity. The entity had no face, but its eyes were everywhere, watching them with an unsettling intensity. Its eyes weren't made of flesh, but of pure darkness, and its contours seemed to float in the air, defying the laws of physics. "You played." The entity's voice wasn't human. It was like a whisper coming from every corner of the room, from inside their heads. Yet at the same time, it felt like it came from a far-off place, a place where reason didn't exist. The entity slowly moved closer, as if studying them, assessing their reactions. Each step made the air feel heavier, as if time itself was stretching. When it spoke again, its voice was like a crack in their ears. "Now! The price will be paid." Marcos felt a wave of terror course through his body. He wanted to scream, run, do anything, but he was paralyzed. The fear was so real, so palpable, that his body refused to respond. He felt the entity's presence invade his mind, as if it were touching every thought, every memory, twisting everything. "The entity, it wants our souls," he murmured, his voice muffled, the words barely escaping. "Lucas, standing next to him, was visibly in a state of panic. He struggled to breathe, as if his lungs couldn't function properly anymore, the pressure of the place suffocating him. He tried to move away, but his feet wouldn't respond. Anna was in a state of catatonia, staring blankly at the entity, as if in a trance. "No, we can't. We can't get out." The entity seemed to be relishing their desperation. It moved closer, and as it did, the board glowed even brighter, as if it was about to consume everything around it. Then, the pieces on the board began to glow, and the images on its surface started to distort. Marcos tried to look at them, but as he did, he saw something impossible. The pieces were turning into faces, familiar faces. Beatriz was there, her face distorted and lifeless, staring at him with an expression of anguish. Then Lucas's face appeared, followed by his own and finally Anna's face. "You are part of the game now," the entity whispered, "and you will remain here until the end." What terrified Marcos the most wasn't the sight of the entity, nor the pieces turning into faces. The worst part was knowing that no matter what they did, the only way out was to keep playing. But with every move they made, they lost more of their essence, becoming more and more a part of the terror they had invoked. The group now understood. The game would never just be a game. They had opened a portal to something that wasn't human, something that couldn't be controlled. And with every move, a part of their souls would be consumed until nothing was left of them, just the game pieces and the entity, waiting for the next move. The environment was unrecognizable. The room was no longer the place they had known. The floor was covered by a thick fog that seemed to crawl like a living being, pulsing with dark energy. The walls twisted and undulated, distorted by a force that didn't belong to the world they knew. The air was heavy, as if the very laws of physics had become flexible, reshaping themselves to the will of something beyond human comprehension. The entity was now fully formed before them, and its presence was immeasurable. Its figure seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of the room, as if it occupied not only that space but reality itself. Its eyes, an infinite darkness, watched each of the friends with unsettling interest, as if it knew everything that was going on in their minds, their deepest fears, their most intimate weaknesses. "You thought you could escape," the entity said, its voice like a murmur, yet reverberating in their minds like a scream. "But you don't understand. The game never had a winner." Marcos felt his hands clammy, his chest tight with crushing pressure. He knew the game was coming to an end, but not in the way he had imagined. He looked at Lucas and Anna, their faces distorted with anguish, but there was something different about them. Their eyes were empty, as if they were losing their essence. He felt that they were no longer the people he knew, but mere shadows of who they once were. "I don't want to play anymore," Marco said, his voice weak, almost inaudible. He didn't know if he had the strength to resist. What was left of him? What was left of them? The entity smiled, though it had no face to do so. "The game isn't about wanting Marcos. The game is about fate, and your fate has already been sealed." The board, which had been glowing up until then, began to transform, its pieces now seeming to merge with the reality around them. The edges of the board stretched out, and the pieces were no longer on the board. Now, they were in the hands of Marcos, Lucas, and Anna, glued to their skin, as if their very souls had been absorbed by the game. Anna screamed. Her voice was distorted, as if the entity was swallowing her words before they even left her mouth. "No, we're not us anymore." Terrified, Marcos tried to pull the piece stuck to his hand off, but it wouldn't budge. It burned, not physically, but in a way that went deeper, a psychological pain that cut through his mind. He looked at the board and saw the pieces rearranging themselves, forming new shapes. The figure that had once been a shapeless shadow now manifested as something far more complex, a humanoid being beginning to take form before them. Its hands reached out toward the group, as if it wanted to pull them into the darkness surrounding it. And it was in that moment that Marcos understood. The game wasn't just a macabre pastime, it was a portal to another dimension, where the players' souls were consumed and turned into part of the game itself. He didn't know if there was a way to escape or if there was still time to turn back. What he did know was that by making that last move, he had sealed their fate. Now, it was too late. I can't. Marcos tried to speak, but his voice faltered. The weight of the terror, now consuming his body, was unbearable. He felt his mind slipping through the cracks of madness, as if he were losing his grip on reality, as if he were being swallowed by the darkness that had been awakened within the game. In a final act of desperation, Lucas tried to destroy the board, but his hands wouldn't move. They were frozen, their minds trapped in that place, in this game with no end. Anna cried, her eyes now completely empty, as if she had already been absorbed by the entity that now ruled everything around them. The entity took a step forward, its shadow completely enveloping the group. You thought you could control the game. Now, you are my pieces, and the game will continue forever. In you, Marcos felt his mind being consumed by a sensation he could no longer identify. The last thing he heard was the sound of the pieces moving again, but this time, he didn't know if he was still awake or if he had already become part of the board. His vision darkened, and the sensation of being swallowed by the entity was the last thing he experienced. And so, the game went on. There was no more game to be played. What remained was an endless cycle, where the game never ended, where the souls of the players became part of the darkness, turning into pieces on the board, forever trapped in the dimension they had invoked. But something even darker remained. The board continued to be found in other places by other people, as if the entity was waiting for new players. And once again, the cycle would begin, always